partly explain the problem. Now, much of the problem is ideological. You can always work with the assumption that you're going to script down your needs, okay, and give yourself more free time. However, unfortunately or fortunately, needs grow, and they often are not within your control. It would be impossible today for most Americans to believe for a moment that they could do without one, the telephone, the radio, and now a television set, and even an automobile. These are now regarded as necessities of life. Whereas years ago, not only were such things unknown, but people didn't even regard owning a horse as necessarily a necessity of life. Okay? They walked, and they were able to work with toolkits that were very primitive, and met most of their needs as long as they lived, which was not often very long lives. Let's be realistic about it. Whatever the value of their nutrition and holistic and magical practices may have been, there are somehow ways in which biology does not quite obey what shamans and magicians enjoin the natural world to do. Because the natural world happens to have a hard core of truth about it that cannot be mythologized and reduced to magic, mystery, witchcraft, goddess worship, god worship, or whatever you like. We've now reached a point where unless the necessities of life are provided to people today, and unless the working day is reduced, at least the preconditions for freedom are going to be very difficult to attain. Very difficult to attain. This is true unless we're prepared to work with the supposition that there will be an elite of middle-class people who can't afford to reject the necessities of life and devote themselves to public service and the public good. And usually such an elite quickly becomes corrupted by the amount of power it has. This underpins a great deal of hierarchy. It should be kept in mind, by the way, that Plato's elite, the guardians who appear in the Republic, are people who divest themselves of the needs of life. They live very strenuous ways of life. They continually have to exercise. They have to eat as little as possible. They live in collective dwellings. They have no family life. They're continually under the supervision of the so-called philosopher kings who select and decide who is going to be a philosopher king and who's going to be a warrior, or who's going to be cast back into the fish pool again and just become an ordinary person. So one of the most important principles of rule, at least according to the philosophers, was to divest yourself of needs. Most people will not do that, understandably so. This is a middle-class privilege, one that we can choose for ourselves, you know what I mean, or discard because of a relatively decent status, however modestly affluent, in a society, you know what I mean, that still will provide for our basic needs no matter what. The homeless, and particularly people in the third world, have fewer options than that. And most working class families, and even middle or lower middle class families, middle or lower middle class families don't have options like that. But as I say, it's now possible to use technology to free people of those restrictions which kept them out of the political sphere, given their needs. And no amount of education, in my opinion, is going to get the great majority of American people to give up their cars, their TV sets, and everything like that. They're not going to do it. They're just going to laugh at you, ignore you, and make you into a marginal freak that they can photograph, you know what I mean? Or they can visit your ghettos, and as they did the Haight-Ashbury during the 1960s in San Francisco, with rolled up windows looking out and taking pictures of you, you see. Or write articles and all kinds of things, until finally the U's impersonal, the freaks get fed up with their way of life and become corporate executives, managers, and bankers, as so many of them have. We've talked about that. But the problematic we face now is at a time when it is really more possible than ever to finally free people of onerous labor. How shall we get them involved in the political process? And the second thing is, what do we mean by a political process today that will not corrupt a handful of leaders who hunger for power even though they may be as boring as Michael Dukakis or as tiresome as George Bush. They want to be able to get their way onto a postage stamp sometime after their death. They want to be recorded in history and monumentalized in some kind of temple out in Washington, D.C. So you've got that written down. Here, these assemblies of the past, which presuppose freedom from onerous toil, presuppose that. And indeed, one of the ways that women were kept in subjugation was by giving them enough work to keep them quiet and out of the picture. I'm not joking. It's not only the working class, later on the working classes were decided by. The men, you see, the world of the campfire and the world of the domestic hearth are very different worlds. In the domestic hearth, women are always cooking, preparing food, softening skins. I'm going back thousands of years, okay? Or else, you know what I mean, when they aren't doing these, they're taking care of the children, tending to them, patching up the house, by the way. That was also part of the household chore, since the domestic hearth was located in the woman's house. She really controlled it, while the men lived in the men's hut. And the two were, in a way, separated from each other, although they even served each other. And in the morning, the woman goes out and starts looking for the berries and the various vegetables and plants. She gathers the food. Later on, she does the most elementary form of horticulture or fruit cultivation, while the men still do the hunting. And when you finish hunting, you can live on the meat for quite a while before you have to go out and hunt again. And invent, as I pointed out early on, all kinds of little exercises like war or aggression or headhunting and other such things to keep yourself occupied, and also build up many of the myths, incidentally built around mother goddesses. They can't find, later on they moved them over to father goddesses, or gods, but built around mother goddesses, but myths, you see, for which they offer sacrifices and everything like that. Women are kept busy, so one of the most effective ways of oppressing women, by the way, was to give them a lot of work to do for the economy. And it becomes ironical in the ecology movement to find that women can become anti-technological the way men are today. You know, we've got to get rid of the technological society. We've got to go back to the Pleistocene, hip, hip, hooray, and so on and so forth. Whereas in point of fact, if we went back in time, tribal society, women would again be occupied with all these chores that kept her out of whatever political life existed in tribal communities. It's ironical. More than ever, the recovery of ego boundaries and the use of technology in the correct way to emancipate human beings from labor, at the same time harmonize them with the natural world, is a tremendous imperative today. And it must be part of a program for social change, which does not mean that all technologies are good, which does not mean that I'm a technocrat at all. I want to get that out of the way so that I, for one, can be a fully human being, or we collectively can be fully human beings. Remember that we always worry about where we're going to eat and what kind of job we're going to have. It's always in the back of our heads, however much we ideologize about good living or right living and just living, all of us are always concerned with the problem of where we're going to get the next day's meal, or how we're going to set up our lives so we're going to get that. And as long as that's in the back of our heads all the time, it tends to preempt the need to get involved in political and social activity. And that's what's getting most Americans trapped, as well as everything else that I've discussed up to now, passivity and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we have to find those institutional forms that will begin to get people engaged. We have to create that dual power. We have to redefine politics again so that it doesn't mean statecraft. That's very important. And it is not as though I'm sitting around and sucking ideas out of my thumb or asking anyone else to do this sort of thumb sucking, if you like. There's a long history of how people got politically involved, at times even when they had a lot of pressing material economic demands that could best be solved by technology when they weren't using slaves. And Aristotle's injunction that slavery would disappear or would be unnecessary when weaving machines could weave by themselves is something we must never forget. So we're always operating within these limitations. We have the potentiality. If we don't think in terms of potentiality, we can't think at all, you see. Very important. We have now the potentiality for freeing human beings from practically all onerous labor. I can seriously, having been trained in the field of engineering, tell you very frankly how we can design ways in which we can eliminate many problems if we're willing to go that far that involve toil. In fact, practically all problems that involve toil. We can even liquefy coal so nobody has to go down there and hammer away at it or, use pneumatic drills. If you want to use coal, if you don't want to use coal, don't use coal. Use solar energy. If you think that solar energy can solve all our energy problems, which I do not think is entirely the case, that's fine. I think we need a combination of energy resources, but that's another question. But we can even liquefy coal. That at least possibility exists, and the most horrible thing is to send people down 3,000 feet and chip away in the darkness with dynamite or coal-chewing machines, you know what I mean? And you don't know how much noise that makes. The noise is enough to unbalance you. I've been in foundries where the noise was so intense that you couldn't talk to each other. And all communication ends when people, even during the 8 hours that they may work, 6 hours that they may work, or any number of hours, can't talk to each other over the noise. And down in the coal mines, these machines that chew up the coal preclude any conversation. And they numb you, they deaden your head. And the noise will do the damage by itself. Now, therefore, what kind of politics are we talking about? And here tradition is of some value because it justifies and validates the possibility of actually engaging in this politics. It isn't utopian, it's real. The Greek polis was an example given that people's needs were met, that people could manage a society. And they did that for a relatively long period of time in a manner based on a face-to-face democracy. And as the book further demonstrates, the Greeks began to form confederacies between pola. Some of these confederacies were admittedly exploitative, like the Athenian Confederacy, the Delian Confederacy, and the second what we call the Athenian Empire, which also took the form of a confederacy. But there were confederacies that really operated as well on a very egalitarian basis. And the book illustrates in some detail, to the extent that this material is known to us, how these confederacies work between these various cities. In a sense, what you had were communes made up of communes. And this was the beginning of real politics. The state, which certainly existed in Greece, but existed in a very elementary form, unfinished form itself, not like our present nation state where everything was professionalized, was in a very prototypic form, as yet, very nascent form. It was more of a nascent state than a state as we know it today. And again, we must not lose our sense of historical comparison. The state is not something that is dumped on people, in which you have professionals running a society for the rest of the community, or for the rest of a nation. Professionals doing it, be they generals, be they soldiers, be they congressmen, be they presidents, be they bureaucrats, separated out of the society and having a monopoly of violence. They alone have the right to kill. Be they cops, or be they legislators, they can legislate a death sentence, which is one way of killing. They can create crimes for which people can be killed. If they violate these crimes, that's the prerogative of a representative, of a senator, of a president, who can also send out troops and kill a hell of a lot of people without having to be accountable to anyone, morally or politically, not to speak of juridically. And the police have that right to kill, ostensibly in their own defense or ostensibly to prevent a heinous crime. But you do not have that right. You do not have that right. In fact, you are incompetent. In the image of the state, you are non compos mentis. You are incapable of being competent. You may drive a car at 70 miles an hour or within the speed limit. The worst you'll get is a ticket. Okay, that's quite a massive thing to take out there, all that steel, such as it is, weighing I don't know how many pounds, especially if you're behind a pickup truck, and really smash